Yes, I'm never sure if that's just me being very fussy, that I want the scale of the image
Yeah.
and the sound and the sensory deprivation. During COVID, my film Strange Object was being shown at festivals online, which
Mm.
was it was a largely disappointing experience because I get no sense of audience, and neither do the curators either. I think it's quite difficult. At the same time, I was aware that at the London Film Festival, for example, I had lots of people write to me who would not have made it there, who were not in London or whatever, and wrote appreciative emails. And I thought, gosh, maybe I should stop being so, obsessed about having the ideal conditions, because it means people can look and engage, and if people are interested. But I have to say, and especially because of the work with doing a lot of work with still photographs, where I'm trying to draw attention to maybe hidden details, and I really want the feeling of moving from losing yourself in the space and the time of an image, and then maybe through sound pulling that away and playing with intimacy and distance. Those are kind of experiences. I am thinking about an embodied experience for the viewer as I'm working. So
Because I now rewatched all the films that you sent me, and I do think they work on the screen because I think we're used to seeing crisp images on that sort of small screen. But again, really being in the space was a completely different experience. I mean, I wonder when you make the work, how do you envision it being experienced, or do you?
oh yeah, very much. I mean, I think of it as a conversation with the viewer. I think about my experience. I'm working with archival images largely found in archives, or yeah, and that's quite an intense experience in itself. My experience of looking at images, encountering an archive, encountering images in an archive, and then searching for meaning, trying to make sense out of them. And sometimes that's, a long, fruitless, you can have long, fruitless days, and other
Mhm.
days you have revelations and very intense experiences, especially because I'm working with images from colonial histories. It can be quite draining, quite upsetting, lots of thoughts. So I try and, when it comes to representing those images for another viewer, I'm thinking about recreating some of that experience, some of that intensity, sometimes feelings of shock or drama. um, yeah, and that feeling of absorbing, of getting lost in the material, getting lost in time. Maybe there's a thing about time as well. So moments when you're getting absorbed in another time, things that were created then, you're imagining what's off screen or what was happening around. And then when I'm back at home, I want to try and transfer that experience and make that happen for somebody else. So that's quite important. I think the time thing is something particular to being in the cinema, where you kind of give yourself over, or certainly to having that scale. Yeah.
That's a moment when you're not in control of like pressing stop or looking closely. You just have to actually engage on the terms that you set when you're in a cinema. So that is quite interesting. Sometimes, in fact, looking at a couple of films, there were moments when I could pause and look closely, and I really think about, am I seeing the thing that I think I'm seeing, or am I seeing the thing that the filmmaker wants me to see, or am I interpreting it in a completely different way? So I think maybe that's something to talk about. When you create space for maybe interpretation or some form of misinterpretation, when you zoom in to details of photographs. So I just wonder, how much are you in control? How much do you feel you're in control of what we feel or see?
I mean, I think I am being very controlling. I'm setting things up. I'm choosing what to draw attention to, but I'm trying to create critical ways of looking, other ways of looking. So with a film like Why Colonel Bunny Was Killed, which is made with the originals were glass plate negatives, large scale. So you could, and my experience of working with these images was that the archive would send them to me about 3 weeks after I'd ordered them. I'd never could remember what it was I'd ordered, and they'd just be identified by shelf numbers. And this each image would pop up at enormous scale on my screen. So I'd be looking at some arbitrary detail, thinking, what on earth have I ordered? What is this? And I'd have to scroll across and then gradually put the image together and try and remember what it was that attracted me in the first place. What was I looking at? And so with that film, I became very interested in a different hierarchy of looking that was imposed on me, and that I could do that for a viewer, that by breaking the composition up. And these were turn of the century photographs, so they were staged with there's a lot of staging going on, and posing, and objects are placed, and so you could just breaking that down. And then it becomes interesting because the different details in the same image start to argue with each other, or contradict each other, or start a different, create interesting contradictions, basically, which makes you question what you're looking at and how it was made. So in some ways, I'm setting that up, but I'm hope I'm stimulating the imagination of the viewer to wonder what it is, what on earth has been going on in this image.
You're stimulating a thought about what may be going on, but are you also trying to present history? Are you also trying to be accurate in what you're presenting? How do you think about yourself as a journalist, or yourself as someone who's supposed to tell truth? Do you even worry about that?
Yeah, I do think about historical truth, which I want to get to somehow. So initially, when I start looking in archives, I want to know what happened. I want to see, or I want to, and I might even look at documents to read them. And but you always have to look in between the lines, because people don't always say what they mean. And quite often, what's interesting is what is not shown. So that's a big part of the logic of what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to read between the lines to understand what has been suppressed and what is not shown, what is off screen, what the setup was, rather than the obvious meaning that's carried with the image. I do quite a lot of research, so I worry about the truth. I worry, but it's a great lacuna. We don't know what happens. I try and do as much research as I can, so I might have an image in my mind that I'm not completely barking up the wrong tree. But at the end of the day, while I'm looking for images of what happened at a particular place and time, in the end, what we're looking at is how people looked, how people photographed. We're looking at this is how people saw the world, and I'm looking at colonial histories. So this is a colonial way of looking, and what is that way of looking? So in the end, maybe it's the look that is being deconstructed and played with, and that reveals something about what happened.
You're obviously looking at the way someone has looked. And in that, you're both presenting us the way that a person has looked, but you're also trying to uncover things that they might have not seen or overseen, or things between the lines. And so, of course, we have images that come from archives, but we also have the narratives, right? The way you tell the story, the way the story unfolds. So I then wonder whether in the telling of the story, whether that's where maybe there is an element of revealing or changing perspectives. And I wonder which of those territories is the one where you're more comfortable, or the one where you see more scope for changing the narrative.
I mean, I suppose I think about the images, putting images into conversation with each other so that they, in some films anyway, the images are commenting on each other. Maybe they contradict each other, maybe they create strange ambiguities or contradictions when you put them together. Apart from the last films, which the last two films are all images from the air, so they're all from one perspective, so there's less of a shift in perspective. Otherwise, I'm thinking, and then I think about sound, so I'm using sound to the sound might be the sound inside the space of the photograph. I'm suggesting it, obviously I'm having to recreate it, but I'm often positioning the viewer in relation to an image through sound. So I'm saying to you, you are inside this bit of desert. I'm evoking that. But in another minute, I might change the sound and say, no, you're in an archive, or no, you're in a cinema looking at an image. So that's another kind of commentary. And then there's the voice. So then there's and there's also, of course, there's words written underneath the image in these albums that I'm looking at. So that's another level of information. And then there's the voice. So I'm writing, or I'm using fan text, or I'm writing a written commentary, which is often a first person commentary. But I don't want to tell, I haven't got the space, for example, in the films which are about kind of aerial bombing, I don't have the space to give a philosophy of, or a history of aerial bombardment, which I'd quite like to, but that you just can't do that. So I have to decide through language what I want to draw attention to that might carry a meaning or an understanding of what the stakes are. So, I mean, it's a complicated business, and I really struggle with it, how to say not too much, because I want the images and the sounds to do the work. If you say too little, then these become rather abstract, pretty images with no context. I tend to feel like I need to give a minimum of basic historical information. At some point, you need to know this is a date, give a place. But mainly, I focus on my position within the film. I guess that's quite a cool thing. So I'm the viewer. I'm the first viewer of the images, and I locate myself. So I think that's quite often my strategy, is that I'm the person who's carrying meaning, and my sense of my experience of images is something I can articulate through turning myself into a character.
We will explore specific works. Since you're speaking about it just now, maybe we could just for a moment reflect on you as an artist. So in some way, you've just said that experience, it's your experience. So you're not trying to remove yourself, is I guess the question. Because historians in some way do that. It's about presenting the story of a political event or series of events without the historian as a protagonist. But I guess you are a protagonist in your work, and that's where you're different, and that's where maybe you're an artist. And so I just wonder, in this balancing of how much you show and how much you say and how much, is there also a balancing of how much of you is in the work? Do you ever think there has to be a bit more of me here, so this doesn't get mistaken for a documentary?
Yes, definitely. I definitely think about that. It's a problem either way. I've found it very hard to speak in any other voice than the first person. Although I might say, well, I'm a character. I think of myself as a protagonist, a character. But I haven't succeeded in finding another kind of voice unless I'm quoting something, quoting a third party. The problem of, I mean, I discovered for me, first person or any kind of autobiographical voice is a form of, I think of it as a performance, which masks as much as it shows, just like all the other elements in the film. You know, and any autobiography is masking as much as it shows. It's a device. So I think of it as a device, a rhetorical device, which has some power. It connects the viewer with the maker, with the images, and sometimes I might have a historical, well, I always have a historical relationship to these stories. I'm in history, so I do think, okay, so I'm in history, therefore I can speak as a person situated in history now, who has a relationship to past events, either literally, personally, through my family, but also just through the history of colonialism, maybe implicates all of us and where we live now. And but the challenge then is, how does it not become incredibly self-centered and all about me? And I have no desire to put myself on a stage. And for instance, in the last film, I'm speaking about things that happened in Iraq and Kurdistan in the 20s and 30s, traumatic, violent things, and which I can't really know about, and I can point to them, but I can't. So, and I'm using my first person voice, but how do I do that without my experience kind of once again erasing the voices on the ground? So that's what that's the negotiation I'm trying to figure out with the voice, is just how to do that. How to do that.
And over the course of your career, you studied contemporary dance. That was where your sort of creative trajectory started in some way. That's being on the stage in some way. That's being quite like prominently in front of the audience. How has this become about slightly removing yourself and allowing the found material to speak to you, and then in some sense you're becoming a channel for something that is found?
I find it quite hard to explain it, really, although I can in a kind of chronology. I mean, I was always working with found material in terms of dance. So I trained as a dancer, but I picked up a camera as a way of working differently with dance and looking for dance or choreography or performances in the world around me. So in that way, that was a stepping back from the act, or a different kind of act of choreography, maybe a choreographic thinking or a choreographic camera, looking at how bodies regiment themselves, order themselves in the world. So that was the film work I was making to start with. At a certain point, I was interested in changing my way of working, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. These were because I was working with groups of people, whether it was more documentary or involved asking people to come and perform in front of a camera. It involved large groups of people, large crew, a budget, a certain mode of production, which has a certain dynamic, which can be exciting and productive, the dynamic of the film shoot. But I started to wonder I started wondering whether it was producing the same way of thinking, the same way of working for me, and through that dynamic. And I was curious about other ways of working. And at the same time, I went and as a mature student, I studied visual anthropology. And I thought that was an interesting bridge for me in terms of thinking about what I was doing as a filmmaker, and my relationship to the people that I'm filming. But equally, I started thinking about that, made me look at the history of anthropology, which is a colonial history. And then I started looking at these images that were produced and by anthropologists, by colonial photographers, and starting to think about the colonial encounter, and that these images have already been made. They're there in archives, and they've got lots to tell us if we can make them speak in a different way. So we're not just simply reproducing the kind of objectifications and problematic things that they were doing in the first place.
And as you said earlier, they're also choreographed. So it's interesting that you're now taking the material, which might have a similar quality to what you were doing earlier, by creating a situation. These were created situations in some way.
Yes, I mean, especially, say, with why Colonel Bunny was killed. I mean, it's so interesting because also photographers have theorized this, but, as soon as time has passed, every bit of dress becomes a costume, every object becomes a prop. And in some ways they are staged like that, and that's just part of life. And but yeah, the gestures, postures, all of those things, I've really enjoyed being able to just draw attention to them, and particularly in relation to what they say about power, how somebody holds themselves in relation to another person in a photograph. And when you can start tracing those patterns, I think it can tell us quite a lot.
So in that moment when you went to study anthropology and you've already had like an established artistic practice, was the encounter with anthropology also an encounter with the personal history, like childhood? And, at some point when someone goes and sees a psychotherapist for the first time, they suddenly realize that their mother wasn't as great as they thought that she was, or that their father was absent. And so, and it's suddenly like you suddenly realize this like 40 years later, and it's a little bit strange, but you begin to process your life on a completely different level. So maybe this was a moment when you also started to look at your childhood, time you lived in Iran.
I think what I realized was I think I felt too anxious to talk about the colonial and the legacies that we live with today. I didn't think I was in a position to address that in any way or speak about it. And when I started thinking about colonialism as an encounter, then I thought, well, I do have a place, and I do have a way of talking about this, and I do have a voice in this, and I have a stake in it. I think as I started, then I thought, I started with why Colonel Bunny was killed. That was my master's film, actually. And I realized that there was this book on a shelf in my family home called Among the Wild Tribes of the Afghan Frontier, by someone called Theodore Pennell, who was a distant relative. No one knew who he was, but there he was. So I thought, okay, this is a way in for me. I must take this book. I have a duty, so I didn't, and that's not a particularly personal film, but it starts and ends with his name. So I didn't leverage the personal within that particularly, but I suppose it made me think, oh, I should speak to this as an artist. Then that led me on to the story about Iran. I found images after my mother died, her photographs from Iran, and I thought, okay, I could go into the BP archive and look at this. I suppose it was a way in. I hadn't figured out how you do it, or how I would do it. I mean, that's just part of practice, working out how you can speak, where you insert yourself really into this history. But yeah, and as I was working, I went to the BP archive, thousands of images, a kind of mass, and this is a long history of the British in Iran. I guess the important thing was me realizing I'm already an actor in this history because I lived in Iran until I was 3 years old, and my brother and sister were much older than me, and my parents were there. My father worked all his life for that company. And but also I'm there moving images around. I'm impacting the archive in some way, and the archive is impacting me. So all of those things together helped shape the voice in it, yeah, and the approach to it.
When you went there, when you went to that place, was it that you were trying to reconcile something that was brewing within you, like a sense of guilt? I'm not actually implying that there is a sense of guilt, but I just like there must be something that you were trying to negotiate that drew you to the place and to the topic.
I think I think about responsibility. I think I have a responsibility to certain stories, and I am empowered to speak to them because of my place in history, and because I can talk about this. So I was there. I can't remember it. I only remember through photographs, and that's what the film is, a lot of photographs. In terms of motivation, I guess that's a grounding for my maybe political motivation. And through that, I work out the personal. I was reluctant to. I thought, what do I say about my mother and father who are no longer alive, who I love, and but then I realized what became important was recognizing that I don't have to judge them any more than I judge myself. So we're here to look at what's important is the structural aspect and the fact that they were participants in this huge project, imperial project, capitalist project, which had certain results. And I was curious about how they saw themselves in that project or didn't see themselves in that project. And that's the question I have. What is my mother looking at? What is she seeing when I'm, I think that's one of the photographs, she's looking in Iran, looking at images of earlier people, and my father's framing these photographs. What are they seeing and how do they see their role? And for me, that makes me think about my role. How do I see the world, and what am I participating in? And then I hope by extension that implicates the viewer to also think about our how we participate in projects, wittingly or unwittingly, knowingly or unknowingly, what our contribution is. So I think that was how I feel about the personal. I mean, I put quite a lot of within the film. I introduced my parents right at the beginning and right at the end, and halfway through I say I'm not going to look at their pictures because they're not interesting, and then I realize at the end of the film they are interesting. They do have a lot to say. But I didn't want, what I wanted to avoid, what I think isn't interesting. I mean, audiences are always interested in the biographical, the autobiographical, the psychological, and I really didn't want to flesh out my family in particular. I want to draw attention to the structure, more to the politics of the whole, of the broader structure that they're participating in, and this way of seeing the world, a kind of Orientalist view of space and time and relation to others. I thought that's what I wanted to emphasize.
I understand the motivation to emphasize that, but I still wonder what your mother saw in that woman or what she thought. I mean, as a viewer, I guess that's my overwhelming intrigue, and I think you understand that audience's urge to go into personal, and that's why that moment when you say I'm not going to tell you what I found is such a sort of cliffhanger. It's something that we all wanted to see, but then you kind of introduce it on your own terms later on.
I mean, some of the things that I thought about doing was in the photographs. I mean, what I found was that my parents didn't photograph the modernity of Iran at all. They photograph themselves going around to tribal villages, for example. That's what most of it, and they're extraordinary photographs. I noticed that when I was in the archive that in the 1930s, employees of the company are doing exactly the same thing. And it's kind of like this loss. Oh, look at the weaving machine. There's a kind of fascination with the primitive and an affirmation of our own modernity, but also a sense of loss. And that's very much part of my mother's, and I say in the film, my mother came back to London and bought a loom like this. So I think it's particular to my mother and her how she's meeting these tribal people in these photographs. You see her, she's fascinated and she's jumping in and
she's young and cool and has cool sunglasses.
Yeah, she's having a great time. And my mother was genuinely interested in other people and other ways of lives and was a critic of colonialism. But I sort of don't even want to go into that. I just think it's interesting. I think it's and what I tried to do as well was to be an anthropologist of my own family and of those photographs, because I could spend some time explaining that the group of people the women are filling up these gourds with water and they're actually made of goat skin. But instead I thought, no, I'm going to describe what my mother's wearing, what my sister and her friend are wearing, because they're really strange as well, what they're wearing, their outfits. So I wanted to exoticize the British as well, and to try and just sort of shift that way of looking a little bit, to realize the strangeness of this encounter between the British and these Iranian tribes.
In your observation that modernity isn't the thing that's being depicted, and there is a fetishization of the sort of indigenous aspects of the society in Iran, one thing that was captured is that house, and me as an architect immediately was really fascinated with the house. But again, we don't get too much of the house. Presumably you don't remember it so much yourself because you were so young.
Yeah, I mean, I remember everything through having seen photographs forever. My brother and sister have got actual memories, and sometimes I consult them about it. They all remember it as an extraordinary house. And I think it's a part of Iran in the north part where there was a whole construction of these extraordinary modernist, quite grand houses. They were so my parents would live there, and then they would move on, and then the next person would come and move in. So generally in all of these companies where people it's like you get a colonial posting in this country and then you move on to the next before you get too involved. In terms of architecture, one of the things that's interesting, I didn't show too much of, but in Abadan, which is where the oil refinery is, and in Masjid-e Suleiman, which is where the oil fields are, they built company cities, BP did, and they got some of the best British architects. They'd bring them over. I think, I don't know who these people are, but there's somebody called Jane Drew, who I believe is quite well known, building these extraordinary. So on the one hand, they're quite extraordinary, but company, I'm not an expert on this, but from what my understanding is that the company towns, in a way, it's a way of controlling your workforce, having them close by. And of course, it's not particularly appropriate to a lot of the Iranian workforce, because the way they live is not in these kind of bungalows in dead ends, in these kind of cul-de-sacs. They have extended families. And so, there's a lot that I didn't put in the film about architecture, which I thought was interesting. I put a little bit because it was a big part of how they promoted what they were doing. But I also noticed that it's very divided according to class. They literally describe the different housings by class numbers. So it has a built-in hierarchy in terms of where you get housed and who you are.
Mm-hmm. But I guess what it does do in the function that it has in the film is that contrasts those communities that are found in the mountains, etc.
Yeah, and there are people living in what was called Paper City, the slums around the oil refineries, who are absolutely disgusting. But of course, I could barely find images of that. You wouldn't, oh, I'm sure it's possible somewhere they must exist, but I certainly couldn't find them within the BP archive, of course. Yeah, and yeah, we didn't have. If I'd had more pictures of the interior, I would have used them. We had quite a lot of the exterior. Yeah, the person who moves into the home after my family is Joy. Or I don't know. It's immediately, yeah, Joy and her husband, who are figures in the film as kind of characters. And she takes very seriously her role as a company wife who entertains, and she has these extraordinary, I went to meet her and she gave me these, what she called dinner party diaries with, just like her husband, who's a geologist, they're doing plans of the surface of the earth in terms of oil exploration. She is doing these diagrams of these dinner tables and designing the kind of, they all have themes. So she has a geologist dinner party with hammers and rocks on the table. I couldn't put all this in the film. I just put one example of them in.
Canadian example.
Yeah,
the Canadian example.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, with fish in the middle of the table. Yeah.
On one hand, the film is about the moment in history and the lens through which the West or the colonizer has seen this territory. But then on the other hand, the film is about you uncovering this archive. So there was a striking sequence of images where you show us the drawings that describe the geology and the terrain, and these white lines drawn on top of the landscapes. And then we see your headphones. I guess we see the contemporary moment in that. We see you sort of in the midst of going through material, and we get a sense of contextualizing yourself in that process of making the film.
I think, I mean, what I wanted to do was to do something with time. So in a way, the span of the film, it starts around, although right at the beginning, there's a title explaining to people that the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, as it was then, that's 1909, they buy up thousands of, miles of territory. But my image work starts in about 1927 and goes right through to really the revolution, which I'm referencing in 79. And I chose different albums from different parts of the history, which I thought each album had, and each album represented maybe a different way of looking. So you have your technical photographs, your aerial photographs, complete with diagrams and geological observations or whatever. There's promotional images, which are either showing gleaming refineries, lots of them, oil rigs, that kind of thing. There's and then there's imagery which is more to do with individual people who worked for the company in different eras who've left their albums into the archive. So they're in there as well. So that's more a view from the ground of different staff, British staff who are taking photographs of their lives. So I kind of arranged them chronologically, rather crudely, as kind of sequences. But what I wanted to do was to also include the present and to keep coming back to the present and to make a relationship between time. I wanted to do something to disrupt the sense of linear time and to kind of, so things would slip. So slippages in time would be, that's something you can do with the moving image, which I really love, is the feeling for time, and to suddenly surprise the audience by, oh no, we're here in the present. And that feels important in terms of how we think about history, that things don't seem like far away, distant. Also geography and mixing up. So I cut between yeah, myself, my headphones, and the images I'm looking at become merged when I happen to find two images that go together. Equally, the aerial view of the oil fields, of oil field or the mountains or whatever, intercutting that with Coventry, which is where the archive is, that felt important to maybe exoticize Britain as much as these images exoticize a faraway place. So I think that's one of the important things, and that's why it felt important for me to be there, is to keep bringing things to mix up time and place and my own location within that history.
Do you see your duty in redefining how we engage with an archive? Do you criticize, or do you have a critical position towards our engagement with the archival material more broadly?
I suppose, I mean, what I know about the archive, especially looking at images, is that it's probably the same 100 images that gets looked at all the time amidst a sea of material that's very poorly indexed, and there's no way of indexing images. Some archives are amazing in how they, you can say, at the British Library, you can say, I need an image which has a gramophone record in 1897 in it, and they will have noted that. But generally, it's about who took the picture or where it was taken or an event it was associated with. So in BP's history, there'll be like 5 big events maybe, and people will keep on going and getting the images associated with those events. So, I mean, I kind of drew attention to the whole process of searching for images, and I emphasize the randomness of what I ended up with, because that's how it felt. I mean, maybe searching is always like that. You go and you look for something, and then you find the interesting book next to the book you were looking for is the one you want. And you kind of want to do that with images. You want to get the whole album and actually come across something that's hidden there. But it's very hit and miss, and you are limited by whoever's indexed them. And I know from speaking to the archivist that there was whole rooms of stuff that hadn't been indexed even, that's just like a mass of stuff they don't know what to do with, and they haven't got time to go through even, and you just want to be let in there, really. I decided to, I thought, well, I'm going to look for what I described earlier, views from the ground, from staff, the more personal, lived experience kind of photographs of people and how they are encountering Iran, how they are constructing Iran in their imagination, and how they are seeing the Iranian workers. And then the more technical, the more PR type images. So I got a range of those things. And then I went away and I thought, I'll sort through all of these, and then I'll go back to the archive when I know what on earth it is I'm doing. And then I'll really pinpoint but I never went back. I'd scanned loads of images. I had this, an agreement, because I wanted so many images. They said, there's no way we can scan these for you. They only had 3 employees. So I had an agreement whereby if I would scan everything, I wouldn't be charged, and they would benefit from me helping them digitize. So that created something interesting. It gave me my physical labor and my experience of physically doing this work. On the one hand, it expanded the possibilities. I could scan the back of photographs, I could photograph the box that the image came in. I had the freedom to do that, which normally you don't have. And it just made me very aware of my physical self doing it and what that means to be in an archive and in history. So I suppose I guess in terms of the politics of it, I think that became important to me, that I'm an actor in history on multiple levels in this story. I was there as a child, that's one aspect, but also I'm here intervening, and I want to, every now and then, I'm going to come back to that and remind the viewer that this is now. And it's a thing that you said earlier, that conventionally historians have erased themselves from the history they're writing. And so it's an effort to not to do the opposite of that. And I think that helps give another layer to the film.
I mean, this I find just so fascinating that you go there to an archive and you have, perhaps you have an idea about what you're looking for, but you always find so much more, or you always discover things that you weren't necessarily looking for, and then your search becomes about something else. I guess the interesting thing is that having a sense of openness when you encounter this material and allowing yourself to dip into other themes that emerge from the material.
I mean, on one level, part of the experiences of being in the archive is, oh my God, how many more oil rigs can I look at? What is this telling me? Nothing. I feel. I mean, so there's lots of that meaninglessness that you're wrestling with, or potential. Then there's like, okay, I've looked at lots of these pipelines. Why are they look so small? And then I'm realizing, oh, the idea isn't to pump lots of oil out, it's to restrict the flow and to control territory. So, there are things that I learn quite literally from looking at these and asking questions and then going off and reading because I don't quite understand. But I guess there's some of the, I think the imagination, the historical imagination is really important to me, because we can mention dates and events and things that happened, and I do that at about 3 points in the film. I just grounding, but ultimately, a feeling for history for me is a feeling for time, and being able to hold more than one time frame in your mind or in your consciousness, and recognizing patterns. Also, a lot of the imagery, I'm looking at all these different ways in which the British constructed Iran in their imagination. What were they looking at? What were they seeing? And I can also refer to texts that are written, and I can remember things that my mother said about Iran and Iranians. And I'm thinking about those. I'm aware that when a lot of the moving image archive of BP, they made a parallel between the ancient ruins of Persepolis, of this great ancient Persian empire, and the modern empire of oil as part of their justification. So they had their own thinking about time, their own mythology that they're constructing, this Orientalist view, which is that these people had a great civilization, now they're kind of backwards, and we are, this is very literal, what the company says, we are bringing them into history through Western science. They use the word science, Western science, again and again. So for me, there's a limit to what I can do with hundreds of pictures of oil rigs, but I'm also thinking about how they're looking at time and these kind of Orientalist mythologies, and how I can bring that out through the photographs. I don't know if I've actually answered your question, but I'm just thinking about some of the things that became important to me, as much as, yes, there's the nationalization of oil and the overthrow of Mossadegh, but all of these cultural justifications, and I think I'm seeing them in the images and the obsessions with archaeology and the primitive. And the parameter, I feel, was quite random. I felt like I had a certain number of days. I went in, I made some decisions, images from the air, images from the ground, propaganda, I had some categories. I go for categories, and I had a certain number of days to get those categories. And then I stopped and never went back. And then I realized it's not about the amount of stuff. I'm never going to see everything that's there. Maybe I should just work with 2 images and find the link between them. It's what the stories that are spun around these images, what's behind the image. you know, and you could do that with quite a few. I didn't have to have as many as I did.
Mhm. That was the real question for me. I was like, how does Miranda choose which image is more compelling? I mean, all of the imagery that you show is incredibly compelling. They are beautiful images.
I mean, I think if an image is compelling, or often I'm looking for sets of images or a series, so you can build them up across time on my timeline. Some things just are compelling. And if they're compelling to me, they'll be compelling to someone else. And what does compelling mean? It means I can invest my imagination in here for one reason or another. Therefore, there's something in here that you can work with, whether it's the literal meaning of the image, whether it has a more metaphoric feeling to it. There's something that can be drawn out. I think personal, I felt like I needed these personal snapshots from people in this. I followed one album from someone in 1927. I had some other personal albums. That gives a feeling of, and these people photographing themselves in the landscape. I think that's quite important to humanize, to situate the people. So there's a few and then occasionally it's like I'm doing a sequence and then I need an image of something to complete this. What I need is something to contrast, or I need you know, and I go into some slightly supernatural territories because what the geologist I'm describing has some slightly eccentric philosophical ideas he's developing, and I want to combine the images of the oil refinery with his ideas about ancient civilizations, so which is already implicit in BP's story. So sometimes there is something I need to complete an idea, and I have to go and find it either within what I've got or elsewhere, or I have to go back.
And how do you know what the audience, do you show your work to people, and do you test whether a certain feeling has been achieved, whether an image should be on the screen for another 2 seconds in order to focus us on that detail, which will then be subverted in the next image? Is this a pure intuition?
I feel like I do need to test things, because I mean the big problem that I consistently have is the thing that I mentioned before, which is saying too much or saying too little. And the thing about saying too little, sometimes, and I show it to my partner's a fantastic editor and critic, and he will say, I'm just totally confused in a bad way. So sometimes I want to create ambiguity. I think history is full of mystery. You're looking for something which does no longer exist. There's an inherent enigma there, which I want to maintain and I want to use as a hook. And photographs are inherently have an enigma to them. They promise, they seem to be proof of something, but they're so much more and so much less. So I'm trying to work with enigmatic atmospheres that trigger the imagination to imagine. But what I found was, say, with the host, I needed to anchor, name dates and places. Every now and then I have to anchor that in "we are here now." I am in the archive, it's 2012, or it's 1936 and we're in the oil fields. Having those, curiously, then freed up then all the more speculative stuff. Then you feel more comfortable in the confusion or ambiguity. So that's an ongoing thing. And sometimes the need to be quite direct with some information so that people just aren't lost. And that's the kind of thing. And I get very lost in the middle of projects. It feels like I was saying to someone, you've got a 1,000-piece jigsaw and it's all over the floor, and you've got 2 corners and a bit of edge, and it's been there for a year and it's collecting dust, and I just don't know if it's ever going to come together. and you just got to keep going. It's the same pieces, but arranged. You've got to get the right. I just tell myself to keep going until it's working, really.
Yet you feel the duty to communicate. So there's also a type of artist that doesn't worry too much if the work will be misunderstood or actually not really clear at all. But I do feel, I mean, just remembering why Colonel Bunny was killed, I understood very clearly all the juxtapositions and the narrative on top.
I think I have some images, and I've done a lot with aerial photography, and it's just, I can put sound on, but without something concrete. It's just too aesthetically, and I love things that are aesthetically pleasing, where I can lose my imagination in them. But what you're missing is that people are being killed and that there are these whole other stakes. So it's quite important for me to find a way of conveying that, as much as allowing the pleasure of looking and listening. But that for me, I would not be doing my job to leave it as a purely sensual pleasure level. These are quite. But I want to. We're talking about things that are quite serious, that are quite heavy. The consequences for thousands of people were quite drastic and traumatic, and in order to convey that, on the one hand, I think I want to have humor, wit. Those things are quite important, because otherwise I'm only going to be talking to the people who are already deep in this stuff, and I would like to make it operate on a formal level or on a narrative level that people can follow and get some pleasure, while also conveying what the stakes of these stories are. Yeah, I think that's quite important for me.
And how does fiction come into this? What's your relationship with fiction?
I'm very interested in, I guess, I feel like, say a colonial ideology is a kind of fictional universe. It's already fiction, it's a fantasy, it's full of projections. And so are many of the images are part of a kind of fictional portrayal of a place that is not being encountered it's being encountered through a colonial lens. So there's already, in a way, I'm having to undo fiction as we look at these images, and I'm having to do some work to invite another reading of the images. And in The Host, I have a character who has a whole fictional universe, which he thinks he's a scientist, and yet he has this fictional fantasy about the origins of civilization. So I'm trying to, on the one hand, critique that, but I appreciate the draw and the appeal, for example, of Orientalism, of fantasies about archaeology and deserts and pyramids. And some of those are rooted in genuine fascination with old things that just are fascinating, but are also associated with power and imperialism. So I'm in the last work that I've been making, I've been working with genre fiction, with science fiction, and in the last film with Gothic horror. And part of that is because those styles of fiction are very linked to colonial history, science fiction, alien invasion, scientific progress. These kind of are built in. And same with the Gothic horror, there's plenty of associations, and I worked with the Mummy's Curse narratives. So, but at the same time, those are useful, because what I need to do is convey a reality of alien invasion and of horror of being bombed from the air. So I'm hoping that I can harness those things, which are pleasurable. They have, as a film viewer, Well, they're also their codes, aren't they? They're codes, so we know them. They're familiar. There's a kind of ironic pleasure in recognizing a form. So I'm trying at the moment. That's what I'm thinking about, is how to harness those familiar forms in order to tell a story that might be also quite disturbing.
I mean, it is an interesting challenge because I mean, there's a contradiction there, right? On one hand, you're trying to present things, present them as they are, with your role of being a bit of a historian. Yet, on the other hand, you need fragments of fiction to make a point about how certain cultures are misunderstood.
Maybe it's the idea that we live through necessary fictions a lot of the time, and maybe allegories and stories bring us closer. That's what I feel, can bring us closer to the truth, are helpful. If we, I mean, I often think that the thing with black and white images is that it just looks, oh, it's history, it's distant, we're disconnected from it. And it's a way to get away from, how do we get away from historical cliches? What we think we know about this country or that country. We think we know about something that happened in the 1930s. So I want to unsettle that quite early on, in order to make it a bit stranger than that, in order to then talk about what an alien invasion might feel like, or and I mean, I feel like it needs both. Then I want to, you need a place where you anchor things in a date and a place and something that really happened, and another place which allows us to cut through cliches or simple misrepresentations of people as barbarians or whatever. We've got so many layers of historical mythologies to cut through. So I think, storytelling's a way of doing it.
And then when it comes to the method in which you do that, the still images, the sequence of photographs, are you also talking to a context, or are you in dialogue with other filmmakers who have done that in a similar way? Are you speaking to Chris Marker anyway? Are you looking at the statues also die?
I think I don't think in that way. I mean, sometimes people will say, oh, have you seen this person's work or that person's work? So I try and inform myself. But I feel like I set myself a particular question or challenge that I want to answer, and that's to do with a historical question or an anthropological question or a sociological problem. And how can that's what I feel like I've got. How do I do this? And I'm just whatever. And I work with very simple means, a scanner. Some of these are like cameraless films, really, with editing, with sound. I've just got quite basic elements, which maybe is a help to not get to limit the number of tools you're working with. Yes, so I feel like I've just got to, I'm just trying to find ways of making these images speak in the way I need them to. Yeah, so I see it more as like endless problem solving, more than, I mean, of course, I love Chris Marker's La Jetée. I mean, of course, I've absorbed,
Yes.
that stuff. But I think when I started working with photographs, I thought, oh, this is like, what's the word? Kind of filmmaking. It's like the frame and the edit and the relationship to sound somehow seem heightened. And those are, to me, I often say with students that the frame and the cut are special effects, the best special effects you'll ever get. They're really powerful tools. So, and somehow they're intensified through the still image within the moving image. And there's an interesting that's what I found. I found these tools, I felt really, really lively because the image wasn't moving and because I could control how long the person looks at it.
And Miranda, do you teach?
I don't have a permanent position. That at the moment I'm teaching a course on archival filmmaking,
Okay.
and I get, so that's more a kind of broader, a kind of historical overview, and then looking at different ethical problems with appropriation, and then looking at different strategies that different artists and filmmakers have used. Looking at different, and then looking at fiction film, people who appropriate. It's a fascinating area actually, because you're looking at a kind of cultural history through film.
I guess we could see you as an educator in some way. On one level, sure, you may teach students a course, but I think the work is also educational.
You could say that. I would hope that how do we look at an image, and inviting you to look at an image differently. It sounds rather dry. I hope I'm not making educational work on another level, but just because it sounds boring, doesn't it? And but I hope, I hope it's an invitation to look differently rather than a lecture.
Absolutely, I think it's educational in the best possible way. It does exactly that. It makes you look at things differently, and it makes you, it takes you on a journey, which is what I think education should be doing. So in some way, I think there is some clues in your work about how we could educate.
I hope also, because in a way there's something quite simple about the way the work is put together. Sometimes I sort of think it's quite accessible. Also, well, I don't know. Obviously, I'm quite obsessed with analog photographs. These are material objects, and this is becoming further and further away from our direct experience of photographs. But everybody can relate to photographs. There's something quite simple and immediate. But then there's also the idea of constructing things from fragments, constructing things from fragments, and what is left unsaid or unshown, the gaps between them, which I hope is quite relatable for anyone who makes things or thinking about how things are made. I guess the construction is very visible, isn't it? I hope you can lose yourself in it, but you're always that the tools are quite simple.
And I guess in analog photographs, you also get the overexposure sometimes, the double exposure, you get the dust.
Yeah, and that becomes quite pleasurable, or it can be. Not being able to see, it reminds us of this impossible task of looking back into time at things, experiences that are gone. And there are lots of ways in which the materiality of objects kind of both attracts us, and it's kind of fascinating, very human, and also, well, it gives you direct a feeling of time, actually, doesn't it? It's kind of an object that's worn out. You're looking, but you might not be able to see.